Welcome back, everybody. My name is Axel. I am your designated Inquirer for today. This is market day and it is 9/15/2020. Today's little tidbit, market bite or whatnot, is a little bit of a rant. Okay, we went and we had a video on Tesla, and we went and we had a video on the Nasdaq, and this is my general thoughts on the market, on money, on economies, and more or less the direction of the world. My zen, and this is my moment, my market moment of zen. I think that's what I'm going to be calling it. Awesome. Okay, so recently I have been subject to some thoughts and ideas from Black Lives Matter activists, but also trying to contemplate what communism means, what socialism means, what capitalism means, what our current pseudo-oligarchist type of economy is, etc. And I've been thinking about, well, how do we go about transitioning from one to another? How do we correct the problems of our, not only of our democracy, but of our economic system? How we choose basically to distribute goods and services and resources. And one thing that a lot of people by default tend to go to in terms of sayings, mantras, etc., things like that, happen to be like, time is money, friend. Time is money. You got to spend some to make some. Apart from time, the concept of time being money, I think a better way to think about it is that money is also a form of energy storage in a way. And what do I mean by this? Well, when we go ahead and we spend, when we do work, when talking about from an engineering perspective, is a force in a given direction. Generally, it takes an amount of time to cover that distance. And when you go ahead and you accomplish, or you go ahead and you move something, and or an amount of force is expended across a distance, there's an amount of energy that's expended, right? To a certain extent, we are all doing a certain amount of work all the time, whether or not we're actively moving, whether or not our lungs are expanding and or contracting. There's always a fair amount of work done, amount of energy expended, amount of money that it takes to keep living. So we need to kind of execute work to keep working ourselves, to essentially perform maintenance. And whether or not we like it, our entire existence is essentially work. One of the things that is in my previous video talking about socialism and capitalism, and they're not really too different, they're really just two descriptions of different aspects of society, whether or not you're talking about the distribution of wealth and whether or not you're talking about how society is more or less formed, because it is still a democracy, and a democracy can work with capitalism. Like, capitalism can be part of basically a democracy in terms of how a democracy chooses to distribute its resources and or its wealth. Socialism is more of a way of how more or less it's kind of governed. It is still a democracy, but in terms of how many decisions it chooses to take, whether or not in the market and or not, is kind of a function of whether or not it is socialism, whether or not it is basically, frankly, anarchy. Because if you want zero regulation, zero input from a government or whatnot, you're basically separating what is basically the people and what is the money. And even though we've kind of wanted to do that, I feel like it's actually impossible to do that. And if you look at the tenets of what capitalism is, an economic system has to accurately pay for costs. In doing so, what has to happen is that costs come in the form of regulation, because regulation comes from basically companies having foregone paying for certain costs, whether or not it's charging taxes and or penalties for waste to the environment, spewing waste into the environment, whether or not it's spewing waste into the internet, whether or not it's using the roads, whether or not it's using the internet. Like, there's a lot of things that are used within the function of creating wealth that have to be paid for. When a company forgoes paying for these things, the infrastructure and or the system around it can deteriorate, impacting its ability to continue making that wealth. And if it's not accurately paid for and or maintained, the company and or the business will suffer, in terms of efficiencies, in terms of profitability, in terms of productivity, etc. Like, there's a myriad of ways in which a company can suffer, including from the backlash of not accurately taking care of what it by default becomes a steward of, because it is using those things, right? And if we go back to basically the notion of money being basically a form of energy storage, we are being used all the time for business, etc. And for a long time, I don't think that companies were. The reason I can let me back up a little bit. So let me get my thoughts straight. If a company uses somebody's labor, the labor is essentially work, energy being expended, right? This work is go ahead and valued by somebody else, in terms of, like, when it goes to be valued and bought by somebody else, what happens is that, in a way, wow, okay, all right, so there's a lot of thoughts going through my head and my mind jumps around a lot. This is a side effect of being ADHD. All right, so this is how I'm going to explain it. All right, so an electron has basically an atom has an electron cloud. The best way to describe this electron cloud is basically a statistical cloud in which an electron can be. And when you go and you find it, basically the algorithm and or life collapses about that position and reveals the location of the electron. When work is done and something is bought and paid for, the algorithm of what determines value kind of collapses and reveals, in a way, to a certain extent, and it's not perfect because it changes all the time, how much work was done, in that there was an amount of money given, which was a storage of energy because a person worked to get that money, and it was given, this amount of energy storage was given to somebody else so that they can further do work and or so that they can give the thing that work produced. Okay? It's all very ethereal and almost subjective, but if you keep going, you can get to basically an objective measure of all of these things. But more or less, it is the worker, it's even in the name, that is producing the value of either a company, of either a particular service, etc., because companies involve all of those things. And or business, company and or business, whether or not it's an individual or it's many. And to a certain extent, there has always been a siphoning and or an absorption of value, of money, of energy by the CEO, by the company, by the investor class, from the amount of value being created by the worker, which even though they are doing work and being able to direct where energy is being spent, the amount that they are absorbing does seem to imply that the worker is not being maintained. Basically, the same way that you can overuse a road, a public utility, the internet, pipes, trees, the environment, anything. What's going on is that the worker is not being maintained. The amount of productivity has been going up for a good long while, but the worker has not been compensated to that same degree. There is now an overabsorption of energy from the worker, and that energy is not being reinvested into the worker to upkeep the productivity, the happiness, which is a measure of productivity, future productivity, and civil unrest for that matter. So I think there needs to more than likely there will have to be a shift where earnings multiples are going to have to come down so that workers can be paid more for their work, for the productivity that they have already been producing, to make sure that the upkeep is adequate on the workforce. Yeah, and that seems to sum up my ideas and my thoughts for today around this subject. If you guys liked it, please go ahead and like and subscribe. If you guys did it, that's cool. If you guys think somebody else should hear this, please go ahead and share. Yeah, stay safe, stay healthy, and until next time, take care. Bye.